My father, Bob Miles, was born in Lupton, Michigan in 1902, and it was rather a nomadic existence. My grandfather was an electrician who had an interest in movie theaters that were just becoming big at that time, at the beginning of the last century. So they moved all over the state, and my father never graduated high school until he was 23.
That's unusual.
No, I'm sorry, let me amend that, 21. He graduated in 1923.
Okay.
And so he, let's say it was rather an adventuresome life. But the way they arrived in Charlevoix was my grandfather had been hired to manage the Temple Theater at East Jordan. And he had a run-in with the manager over there, and he heard that the Majestic Theater in Charlevoix, which was only a few years old at that time, was available. So he came over and he bought it. So the whole family ran the theater, and this was during the time of silent movies.
Wow.
Now, my father was about 15 at the time. I think they came here in 1917. They came up on the boat, the Hum, the famous little passenger steamer.
Okay.
And it was, we call it the Great Migration. And my grandfather was the general factotum. My grandmother played the piano for the silents. My Aunt Elsie ran the box office.
Okay.
My Uncle Walker was general cleanup. My two aunts, Lucille and Janice, were the usherettes, even though they were very tiny at the time. And my father ran the projector.
Wow.
And this was at the time when the celluloid stock did not come back on a take-up reel. It went into a barrel in front of the projector.
Oh, man.
And it was highly flammable, and at that time there were many, many fires in movie theaters around the country with tragic results, but fortunately nothing ever happened. And my father said that his biggest memory of being the projectionist was he had to watch the screen at all times to make sure everything was going right. He had to sit through the Douglas Fairbanks Sr. Three Musketeers 17 times. And he vowed that he would never watch another version of it for as long as he lived. And he kept to his promise.
That's amazing. I hadn't realized the fire was such a risk at that time. That's
Yes,
an
it
interesting
certainly
anecdote.
was, yeah. So he graduated in 1923, and then he worked for a year, and then he went to Western, which is now Western Michigan, I think it was called Western Normal or something like that at the time, to become a teacher. But at that time, the teaching jobs were very few and far between. And he was actually on the state tennis championship team at that time. We have his medal at the Harsha House Museum. And in his senior year, he decided it just wasn't worthwhile to graduate because he wouldn't have a job when he was done. So during the summers here, he had befriended a man by the name of Baron Callan, who was one of the top social photographers in New York City, who summered here and also set up a studio for the summer people.
Okay.
And my father had done work, photography work, ever since he was a teenager. He was fascinated with it. And one of the early things he did, let me find it here, he was always fascinated by the swan at the Chicago Club. And there's a long story behind this, and I won't do it today, maybe some other time. But these swans are called Pericles and Aspasia, and they came here from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, mainly because the man who owned them had bought them and brought them from England, and they chased his daughters. They were very mean. So to get them away from his daughters, he shipped them up here to his summer home, the Chicago Club.
Okay.
Where they were the basis of the entire swan flocks in northern Michigan.
My goodness. What a great story.
So Pericles and Aspasia were, of course, Pericles was the leader of Athens
Right.
in the 400 BCs, and his wife was the nagging, shrewish Aspasia.
Fitting for a swan. A fitting name.
So he showed Baron Callan some of his work, and Baron encouraged him
It's a lovely photograph.
and took a portrait of my father himself.
Okay.
And this is one of two that we have, and you'll see here in red pencil, Baron Callan, New York City. Well, my father dropped out of school, and he went to New York, to the Photography Institute, whatever it was called there, to get his schooling. And he arrived in, I think, September of 1929, and of course, a month and a half later, was the Great Depression.
Sure.
So he saw everything that happened in New York City at the time. When he came back to Charlevoix after a year or two, and he established his first photography studio at 314 Antrim Street in 1931. And the first picture he took, the first formal portrait, was of Carl Erber, who owned the Ford agency here. And you'll see here Bob Miles Charlevoix in red pencil, just as his mentor, Baron Callan, did on his portraits.
That's neat.
So that's the first formal portrait my father took. So he courted my mother in the early 1930s. They got married in 1935. And the house that we live in, that I still live in now at 109 Park Avenue, had been owned by the Hammett family. And Dick Hammett was one of his best boyhood friends. And my father always loved the house, but he loved more the location, which was just a block from downtown.
And on the channel.
So he knew he had to have it. So this being the Depression, nobody had any money. So he went to all of his clients who owed him money. They scrounged throughout both of their families. And my father finally, the house had been lost during the Depression. And the bank, he kept pestering the bank, and they said that they would give him the house. It was for sale for $5,000. If he could give them $1,000 down payment, they would take $1,000 off the price. So they scrounged for this $1,000, and by the time my parents got done with the down payment in 1935, they had 19 cents left.
Oh my gosh.
And that's how they started out the second year of their married life.
Amazing. Well, what you could buy for 19 cents, you could actually buy, several things for 19 cents back then, but that's an incredible story.
Well, after he established this little studio over at 314, then he moved downtown, where the sunglass shop is now.
Okay.
And that is next to the Villager Pub. And he was there for several years, and he loved it downtown because he could get all the summer people. So he was quite a prankster in his own way. He had a very dry, subtle sense of humor. And he took one of the photos from the water tower, and in the background he imposed Mount Fuji. And he made a postcard out of this. He had a postcard rack out in front of the store, and he loved to stand inside the store and watch people's reactions as they walked down the street.
Too bad he didn't have video cameras at that time.
Right. And there were two stories. One woman picked it out of the rack, turned around, screamed, and dropped it on the sidewalk and went hurrying on her way.
Oh, no.
Never stopped back. Another man took it out of the rack, and he looked across Round Lake, and he looked back at the card, and he took it over to the curb, and he held the card up like this, and he went like this, trying to find out where it was,
Where the mountain was.
and he came back and put it in the rack and walked away shaking his head.
That's another great story, my goodness.
So over the years, he of course photographed everything in Charlevoix. He was actually, and he didn't even know it at the time, an unofficial historian of how Charlevoix developed from the 1930s up through the 1960s until he retired in 1972. So here are some of the shots of what he got, and I could keep you here for hours with hundreds of photographs of what he did, but obviously we can't do that.
So these are what you feel are highlights.
He took an awful lot of what was in the high school gym, which is now, of course, the Charlevoix Public Library, the Stax Room, and many, many pictures of the activities that went on this stage. And this was actually the community center for decades, this room. This particular picture is one of the barbershop quartet jamborees that took place from 1942 up until the mid-1950s. And it was considered to be one of the top barbershop quartet gatherings in the country at the time. And everybody looked forward to it. And they said that in the big hotels here, the Beach and the Belvedere, if you woke up at 5 in the morning, more likely than not, you would hear harmony wafting through the hallways.
Because they were practicing, or just performing?
Well, just staying up until all hours of the night singing their hearts out.
Okay, got it.
Those were wonderful weekends. We also have a complete chronicle of the construction of our bridge, from the first gouging of the earth right up until the ceremony that dedicated it. This is one of the most valuable sequences we have.
And what was the date, again, to remind everybody about when this
The bridge started in 1947, and it was completed in 1949.
That's what I thought, I remember 49.
Yeah. And he also loved to fly. He had a friend called Joe McPhillips, who had McPhillips Flying Service up at the airport. And he would go up with Joe all the time. They would fly as far south as Traverse City or up to the Straits of Mackinac to take pictures of the bridge. And we have wonderful, wonderful aerial shots of Charlevoix. And these are especially valuable when people are coming in looking for a specific location.
Right. Yeah. And we can see out there in particular the point, South Point, without a cement plant.
Right. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
So we almost have a complete development of the downtown taken from the air.
Okay. That's
This is one of his finest postcards. He started out in black and white, of course, and then in the 1950s he switched to color, but this is one of the nicest ones he ever did. This is the Coast Guard station that was down on the channel, and this was taken down in 1965. It was put up in 1901, so it was there for 64 years. And I only lived a block away from this, and when we were kids, we loved to go down there because the buoys were sitting there and they had the chains and the ropes coiled up on the ground, and you could smell the lake there. You could almost smell the bottom of the lake. It was so wonderful. And all the men at the station were very tolerant of us kids, and we'd run up and down the launch platform and we'd climb in and out of the boats, and nobody seemed to care. I don't know if you could do that these days.
yeah, that would be difficult, I'm sure.
And here is one of his color works. This is the Belvedere Hotel, that of course is no longer there, it came down. But I like this photograph because it shows the exact location of the railroad trestle.
Which no longer is, we don't even, there aren't even any pylons left anymore. So
Not on this side, no.
That side, right.
About the only thing that's left is the roadbed on the north side with the stone abutments next to the buoy tending station. In June of 1935, downtown, the Hotel Charlevoix burned. And for the first time, the city fathers, it was a very long building, it almost went down to the Round Lake waterfront. For the first time, the city fathers could see through the block. You could see from Clinton Street, you could see Mason Street. But now they saw the potential for a park. And Earl Young, Bob Bridge, the president of the bank, and several others got together and they canvassed the entire downtown to see if they could buy every single building from the bridge to Antrim Street. Now, this was the Depression.
Right.
This was quite a dream and quite an undertaking. They succeeded in getting the buildings on the 300 block, except for two holdouts at the end. And everything came out, and by the end of the summer of 1935, this was starting to be developed. So thanks to Earl Young, thanks to Bob Bridge, and thanks to a few others, this is what we have today. This is the jewel of our park system,
Yes, it is.
which in a couple of months will be even better than it was before. Now this building over here, this long building, that is now the Harbor Club condominiums. And that building was built by Logan Thompson of the Belvedere. And Logan Thompson was the founder and president of Champion Paper, which was located in Ohio. And he built this boat for his boat, which was called the Sylvia IV. It was 135 feet long. And just a month or so ago, Mr. Joe Arvilla passed away. And Joe crewed on the boat. And he told me that when they brought the boat in, they had so little room for it that they had to bring it in as far as they possibly could. Because when they closed the door behind it, he could stand on the aft on the aft platform of the boat, put his thumb on the back railing, and his little finger would touch the door of the boathouse.
Oh, jeez. That's amazing. I remember that as Brown Marina in my youth.
Right, it used to have the words Brown Marina right on the
Across
roof.
the top of it,
Yeah.
so, but that must have been probably 20 years, 30 years as the Sylvia's home.
No, only a few years.
Only a few years?
Yeah, because in 1930, he found the Sylvia V, which just became known as the Sylvia. That was 191 feet long, the most beautiful boat that ever came in here. And it would dock approximately up here by Fairport Marina,
Okay,
closer to his home.
It would not have fit in that boathouse at all.
No, the back end would have been sticking out.
Yep.
And through the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, and the 60s, my father chronicled the people who went to Charlevoix High School, and grade school, and middle school. Hundreds of photographs
Yeah.
of these groups, the bands, the choirs, the football teams, the basketball teams, the track teams.
Everything.
This is a wonderful legacy that he left for us. I don't know if they're doing portraits like this today.
They do gather in the yearbook, they're in sections in the yearbook, but I'm not sure that they're available for people to purchase. It's you purchase the yearbook and then you would get
Right.
a representation of it.
What's nice about these is we can zero in on people and we can copy them.
Yeah. So you have all of those then at the Historical Society, the whole collection?
We have a stack of negatives approximately that high of nothing but these types of pictures.
That's a great resource, that is.
And then he went to color photography in the late 40s, and by the 50s he was starting in his postcard business, serious postcard business, all over northern Michigan, as far south as Traverse and as far north as Mackinac Island. And this is one of the classic sunsets that he took of Charlevoix. We have a lot of these. And of course, being only 1 block away from Lake Michigan, he could just walk down with his camera every evening he felt like it. And
Right, and get those spectacular
Right.
moments. Yeah.
And he also chronicled a lot, and I mean a lot, of the boats that came in. This is the Milwaukee Clipper that came in only once in 1943. They had been trying to get it for years. It was the biggest passenger liner on the Great Lakes. The worry was, number one, coming up the channel, could they make the bend in the channel, which starts near the weather vane? As it turned out, it was very easy. Number two, what to do with it once it got into Round Lake. Well, they finally decided that they would give it a try, and they convinced the captain to come in. So it came in, and you see this little port back here. That was the gangway that the passengers had to get off of. But the problem was, the city dock was only about 100 feet long. So there wasn't too much room to get them off onto the dock.
Okay.
So what they had to do was bring the boat forward, and it almost touched the piles of the Charlevoix Lumber
I was
Company.
going to say, it looks like it doesn't fit in Round Lake.
No. And it was so long that my father said if you stood on the bridge,
I'll put it behind you, Dave.
if you stood on the bridge, you could not see Round Lake. The boat was so big, it blocked the entire view.
Amazing.
So it came in once, and it left, and it never came back.
That was it. Okay. We tried, but this one was too big for us.
But his favorites were the North and South American, and he had scores and scores of shots of those boats. He even chased them up to Mackinac Island to get them when they were there together.
Oh.
And this I consider to be, we have 2 more to go here, this I consider to be his most beautiful photograph. It's the Manitou Lightship, which before they built the light up at the Manitou Island,
Okay.
it would winter here and just sit in Round Lake for the winter. And this was in the 1930s. And
Incredible reflection.
isn't that
in the
something?
harbor. Yes, absolutely.
And his classic, this is the one by which he will always be known. This is the one of the wave breaking over the South Pier. Now, the story about this was, it was in February of 1935. We had had a tremendous storm. The temperature was -2. The wind was coming off the lake so hard that when he drove down there, he could hardly open the door against the wind. So you can imagine what the wind chill factor was. And he finally got out of the car, and he put the camera on top of the car, and he could hardly hold it steady. But just as he was ready to release the shutter, the sun broke through the clouds. He didn't even know it was going to happen. And all of a sudden, everything was flooded with sunlight, just as he shot it.
Yeah.
He made, he told me, over 1,500 copies of this photograph, and he hand-tinted 500 of them. And I know there's one in Egypt, I know there's one in Japan, I know there's one in New Zealand, they're all over the world.
Incredible. I had no idea about that.
So this is the picture by which he will always be known.
Absolutely.
So finally, after 41 years in the business, he decided it was time to retire. And he retired in 1972, and he got into Petoskey stones, and he built the 200-story Petoskey stone tower for the bicentennial, which used to be at the old library on Clinton Street, and it's now at the Harsha House Museum. And lived a very productive and long life, and passed away at age 84 in 1986.
Well, that's tremendous. Thank you for sharing all that with us.
Thank you.
It'll be a great record for us to have. And what got you interested in starting the Historical Society? Were you part of the beginning of that, or was someone
No.
else a part of it?
No.
Tell us that story, please, because that's certainly become a prominent fixture in our town today.
It was one of those situations where, I guess you might say you have the type of personality that when you grow up so close to this, you're too close to the forest to see the trees. When I was growing up, I didn't give a fig about Charlevoix's history. And I think it was quite disappointing to him because he was so involved in it, and he would tell me things, and I'd say, yeah, well, you know, when you're young, you have other fish to fry, and that. So when I came back to Charlevoix in 1972, he was even doing more historical work then with the society. That's when they got back together. That's when they reorganized. And still, again, I wasn't interested. Well, he passed away in '86. My mother took over his seat on the board of directors. And then when she passed away in '97, they asked me to fill in. And I sort of reluctantly said, okay. Then, at the time, they had a part-time director, and a lot of backlog was happening, so they asked if I would be interested in working part-time, helping to get caught up. Well, it was like putting a rat in a terrier's mouth. Once I got a hold of this, I couldn't let go. And it was one of the most fascinating things I have ever encountered, was coming in and looking at this photo archives and this document archives, and it was like having this one door open after another. Well, the job that I had ended in 2000, and they asked me to come on part-time. So in the meantime, we had started working on the Bob Miles Charlevoix II book, which came out in 2002, 476 pages.